for joining us for Live with the League. I'm Kim Knox, Chair of the Program Committee for the League of Women Voters of San Diego. We are using Zoom webinar for this event, so attendees will not appear on audio or video. If you have any technical problems, please send me an email at program@lwvsandiego.org. And if you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A icon on your Zoom screen to type a question. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing on our website tomorrow. Now, I'd like to introduce LWV San Diego President, Lori Thiel.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. And thank you all for attending. I appreciate everybody carving some time out of their day to come to an event like this. It's very important, our topic today. And those of you who also donated to this event and to our organization to help us continue to bring programming like this, I truly appreciate your financial support. So again, welcome. I'm Lori Thiel, President of the League. I just wanted to, usually this is a time where I talk about our upcoming events. And typically we have a couple of events each month at least, and we are taking a little bit of a break in December. We've just gone through a very thoroughly exhausting election cycle, and our members are all very due for a break. And so the only upcoming event I have to share with you right now is Monday's book club. It is watching the film Kiss the Ground, and you can find this information on our website. Kim will type that website URL in the chat, but you can go to our website, excuse me, click calendar, and you can see all of our upcoming committee events and opportunities to participate in our committees, and you can join this book club as well. For today's program, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors. They include Indivisibles of San Diego, which represent 11 indivisible groups from California's congressional districts 51, 52, and 53. They're co-sponsoring with us today. Center on Policy Initiatives is also a co-sponsor. NAACP San Diego branch is co-sponsoring with us today. And also a Jewish Community Foundation of San Diego, including President Beth Cyril. So I'm going to introduce Beth and let her tell you a little bit about her organization before we go forward with the program. Beth?
Thank you, Lori. We are delighted to be co-sponsors today. The Jewish Community Foundation of San Diego has been San Diego's largest funder, philanthropic funder for more than 50 years. We do work with philanthropists from the very, very wealthy to the very modest. Our goal is to help everyone be as effective a philanthropist as they can be. And about 80% of the grants that leave the Jewish Community Foundation go to secular causes. That's sort of an unknown thing about us. So we are really quite engaged in making San Diego the best place to live for the most number of people. And civic participation and civil civic participation is really key to that. So thank you, Lori.
Great, thank you, Beth. It's great to have you here, and all of our other co-sponsors as well. Okay, well, let's get started. Today's event is moderated by League member Joni Halpern, who has served low-income families and individuals throughout San Diego County as a staff lawyer for the ACLU, the Legal Aid Society, director of a grassroots nonprofit, and now as a sole practitioner. And she will lead us through, she's going to moderate today, she's going to introduce our speakers, and she's going to lead us through the next few moments of their presentation. So Joni?
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's an honor to introduce the speakers today and to introduce this event. I'd like to give you just a little bit of a perspective that we're trying to convey today at this event. For almost 2 decades, the middle class has been hearing about income inequality. Most of us think this refers to the gap between rich and poor. And so if we don't feel that we're poor, we don't worry much about this gap. But in fact, income inequality is not just a problem for the poor. It is also a thinning out of the middle class. And yet we are ignoring the symptoms that it affects us too. Many of the participants at today's event, many of you who are attending, have children and grandchildren who've already experienced life circumstances that have harmed them economically. Divorce, disability, illness, the birth of a child, job loss, reduced work hours, independent contractor status when you'd like a permanent position, and the rising costs of childcare, healthcare, and housing. When those circumstances happen to middle-class children, they often do not have the resources to cover the increased costs or the losses. But they do have one thing that poor children do not have, and that is they can turn to their middle-class parents for help. The wealth of their parents, once thought to be a stable resource for those golden years and maybe something left over for inheritance, is now needed to plug the holes in the sinking economic ship of our children and grandchildren. Personal savings, retirement funds, the equity in our homes, the space in our homes, all of these are being put to use to keep our children and grandchildren from falling farther down the economic ladder when life changes occur. Many older persons are working longer. They're refinancing their homes, they're signing up for reverse mortgages, they're renting spare rooms to travelers, and they're throwing their bucket list in the trash. All of this just to keep themselves and their progeny from capsizing on the seas of middle-class life. The argument can be made, however, that we, the middle class, we are the architects of our own demise, for we have voted for or acquiesced in public policies at all levels of government that have favored the very wealthy over all the rest of us, and to entice us to vote against our interests. The people in power have sold us two mythical storylines. The first is that the poor are sucking us dry and we must stop helping them. The second is that if we leave rich individuals and corporations free of taxation and regulation, they will optimize their profits and create wealth for all of us. Neither of these storylines has ever been true, not in this country, not in any country in the world. But the American middle class has widely accepted them and allowed government to facilitate a massive transfer of the nation's wealth to the richest 1% of our population. This transfer of wealth is destroying the real wealth of our nation, our people, and our resources. And only in the last couple of decades have we begun to acknowledge that stories of hardworking Americans that keep ending in economic decline are telling a story that can affect all of us. The middle class used to be a synonym for hope. Hope that any person who worked hard and played by the rules could earn the real American dream, not the dream of fancy cars and mansions, but a stable home, a decent job, a healthy community, and the wherewithal to care for our families. That dream is dying, and so is the hope that fed it. Today, the middle class is sliding down the economic ladder. And income inequality is just one of the terms that is used to describe that decline. But it is one that we must understand, for only in knowing the truth can we protect ourselves. This is the League of Women Voters, and we have one asset that is prized, especially today. We have credibility. So if we learn the truth about something, we actually have the capability of telling other people about it and having them believe us. And that is why I feel privileged today to be part of this event and to introduce 3 speakers who will help reveal the truth about income inequality. The first is Michael Hiltzik. He spent his entire journalistic career helping readers understand how public policy affects everyday people's lives. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning writer who's reported from national and international bureaus. His business column and blog at the Los Angeles Times explains what is happening to us as business and government pursue strategies that exclude our needs. He's written several books on important topics such as the New Deal, the role of science in launching the military-industrial complex, and Social Security. His most recent book is called Iron Empires, Robber Barons, Railroads, and the Making of Modern America. It's a history of competitive personalities and forces that built the American railroad system. Dr. Bill Oswald is a guy who's always had one foot in academia and one foot in the low-income grassroots community. In San Diego, he's well known for helping transform low-income communities that were formerly silent into confident participants in the public dialogue. Currently, he's Associate Executive Director of the Global Action Research Center. Global ARC bridges the gap between academics who study the origins and solutions to urban problems and the grassroots community that experiences those problems but is never asked how to address them. Our final speaker is Tess Thorman. She's a research associate at the Public Policy Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to informing and improving California public policy through independent, objective, and nonpartisan research. Tess has written extensively about poverty, inequality, and the social safety net. One of her recent projects focused on California's stake in the 2020 census. I am pleased to welcome our awesome speakers.
First of all, I want to welcome all of you to this event and to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting it on this very important subject. I've been asked to start this event off by placing economic inequality in its historical context. And I'm going to start the process sort of in reverse, so to speak, by giving you a picture of where things stand right now. This is a tweet from Bob Reich, who many of you may remember was Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, and as a professor of public policy at Berkeley, Bob has kept an eye on the condition of the working class ever since leaving government. And as you can see from these figures he provided, in good times and bad, wealth in America flows uphill. Over the last 11 years, Jeff Bezos, he's the founder and chairman of Amazon, Bezos' net worth has increased by 29 times. Meanwhile, the federal minimum wage actually has fallen in real terms because $7.25 in 2009, or rather $7.25 today, is worth only about $5.88 in 2009 money. So yes, to answer Reich's question, we do see something wrong with this picture, and that's what we're going to be talking about over the next hour and a half or so. So now let's take a look at the big picture and the historical picture. This is a chart that goes back to 1776 of the so-called Gini coefficient, which is a sort of geeks or nerds measurement of inequality on a scale of 0 to 1, in which 0 is total equality, in which everyone shares equally in economic wealth, and 1 is a condition in which the rich get everything. This chart shows trends for the US, Britain, and the Netherlands, but let's just concentrate on the US for our purposes, which is represented by these blue boxes on this chart. What it shows is that colonial America was the most income egalitarian place on the planet at the time. The richest 1% only got about 8.5% of total income in 1774 when you include slaves, and 7.6% when you count only free Americans. And that should give you a sense as to how much enslaved workers contributed to the economy. The Gini coefficient, as far as we could measure it today, was about 0.3 to 0.4 then for the United States. Today, it's more than 0.5. Anyway, between 1850 and 1860, that effect began to disappear. Inequality in the US peaked around 1875, which was the dawn of the Gilded Age, or what we might call the first Gilded Age, since I think we've been living through a second Gilded Age in recent years and decades. What the chart shows is that inequality slipped starting in the mid-1920s and plunged during the Great Depression and through World War II and the first post-war decades, reaching what may have been the high watermark of wealth equality in the US between 1950 and the mid-1970s. It began climbing again in the mid-1970s, and today it's back to where it was about in the 1870s, which explains why I think we can say that we're in another Gilded Age. Now, the important takeaway from here, I think, is that the eras of relative equality are times in which great social advances can be enacted. The New Deal and the Great Society, or Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, these are all artifacts of periods in which there was more equality than inequality in the US. And that's because the idea that the economy or economic wealth is shared by everyone makes it easier to help out members of society who may have been falling behind even so. During times of inequality, however, there's a sense of every man and woman for himself or herself because the majority feels that they've been left behind. And as a result, you get corrosive conservatism and more stagnation. And that's what we've been seeing, certainly over the last 4 years, but in a larger sense, over the last several decades. The Tea Party, by this measure, was a phenomenon that arose in the Darwinian struggle for a piece of what seemed to many Americans to be a shrinking pie, so that helping out those who had fallen behind was interpreted as someone trying to take away something that belonged to me. Now, we can trace some trends that both stemmed from and contributed to rising inequality in these recent years. Here's the path of corporate profits from 1994 to 2020. It's the red line at the center of this chart. You can see that it's on a steady upward trajectory, except for the recession of 2008, 2009. Meanwhile, the labor share of the economy is down there at the bottom in blue. Now on this chart, it's fallen to about 85% of what it was in 1994, but that's more visible in this chart. You can see here that the labor share of the economy has been falling almost steadily since about 1970. The little uptick on the far right, by the way, I think reflects the CARES stimulus from earlier this year, which obviously hasn't been repeated. And I think the fact that the CARES stimulus has basically been terminated and fallen away accounts for the fact that the spike at the far right is spiking back down. Now, here's another explanation of what's been happening. Through 1974 or so, worker compensation pretty closely tracked productivity gains in the economy. And those productivity gains are what account for general economic growth. From 1948 to 1979, as this chart shows, productivity more than doubled and compensation almost doubled, but it was still close. Productivity gained 108%, compensation gained by 93.2%. So they're tracking pretty closely to one another. Since then, however, we've seen the great divergence. From 1979 to 2018, productivity increased by about 70%, but compensation only by 11.6%. And where did the money go? Well, it was upstream to corporate profits, as we saw a couple of charts ago. Now, one trend suppressing the labor share is stagnation of the minimum wage, which also influences pay throughout the working class, not just for the lowest wage earners. The minimum wage reached its highest real point, that is, its point adjusted for inflation in 1968, when the $7.25 in place in 2013 would have been worth the equivalent of $9.40. At the growth rate of inflation adjusted average wages, that's the dark blue line here, the minimum should be close to $11 an hour today. Had it risen at the growth rate of US productivity, it would have been 19, even 20, or maybe $21 an hour today. But it's $7.25. So every time you hear talk of it being raised to $15, employers squeal like stuck pigs. But obviously, as this chart shows, they've been getting a real bargain and a bigger bargain every year. Now, we hear a lot, mostly from conservatives and the spokespersons for the 1%, about all the great opportunities that we have in the US to build retirement savings, that is a nest egg, for people of all walks of life. But that's pretty much a scam. Here's the take-up rate of 401k plans among those whose employers offer those plans. The dark blue lines are defined benefit plans, and those are traditional pensions, corporate pensions as we've come to understand them. You can see that they were fairly evenly distributed, or at least more evenly distributed than defined contribution plans, the light blue bars, which are 401ks. Defined benefit plans, which have really been disappearing at a great rate, they applied to about 6% of the lowest 20% of wage earners and 27% of the best paid wage earners. But you can see that 401k plans, as I said, are much more unequally distributed. They're very popular among the highest paid workers. 68% of those in the top 20 have them. And that top 20% is a segment that earns at least $140,000 a year and averages close to $300,000 a year. But only 4% of households in the lowest 20% of wage earners have them. That segment's income is less than $26,000 and it averages only $14,000. And why is the take-up rate so low? Well, I would argue it's because these segments, and we're talking about the economic segments all the way up to basically the middle class. That's the middle 20%. They simply don't have the disposable income to put away for retirement. Now let's turn to taxes. We keep saying, or we keep hearing, that America's tax system is progressive. That is, that it burdens the rich more than the working class, but it's become a lot less progressive over time. In 1950, the wealthiest Americans faced combined tax rate, that's federal, state, and local, of 60 to 70%. You can see that at the far right. You can see, if you track that light line, you can see how sharply the American tax system was in terms of its progressivity in that era. In subsequent decades, the tax burden on the wealthy, that's the top 10%, especially, continued to decline until today. The top 0.1%, the top 0.1%, 0.1%, and the richest 400 households pay 32% or less. The tax burden of most Americans, however, has been rising over time, as you can see by the lines toward the left. Now, what gives us the impression that America is a high tax regime burdening the wealthy? Well, it's political posturing mostly by people who have powerful political megaphones. So I'm going to close my introduction here with the best observation about America's tax system that I've ever read or seen. It was made by Herb Stein, who was Richard Nixon's economic advisor and one of the men least likely to be mistaken for a liberal economist. And here's what Herb Stein wrote in the Wall Street Journal in 1996, when a so-called flat tax was all the rage among conservatives. What he wrote was that I will offer one law derived from 60 years of observation since I studied economics at the University of Chicago. Whatever is the existing degree of progressivity in the income tax, the people who pay the top rate will think it is too much. And since those people have the most political power, that's the way that the American tax system has evolved over time. These people have always thought they pay too much. They want to pay less and less. And even today, they complain that they're paying too much. And the harvest is increasing economic inequality for all of us. And with that, I'll end my opening presentation right here. And thank you.
Go ahead, Bill.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Let's share my screen here. I'm going to talk about income and wealth inequality and some of where it's come from, but how we perpetuate it. So what I hope to do today is cover, again, how unequal is that distribution of wealth? Where does this inequality come from? And how the government has and does respond to poverty and the unequal distribution of wealth? And lastly, what are some very, very broad ways that we might begin to address this issue? So I want to start off by talking about the difference between wealth and income, because income is what you bring home, the money you have in your hand, where wealth is the assets, the storehouse, the resources that you have that help you when you don't have income. And this chart to the left, I've loved. It's a little outdated, but I don't think, particularly looking at Michael's data, that this has changed very much. But what it's saying is the folks with the top 20% of wealth in this country, if they were to lose their income, they could survive on their wealth alone for just under 114 years. Now we compare that to the bottom 40%, where they could, if they lost their income, they could last for about 3 months. And that's the bottom 40%, because most of the people in that category have 0 to negative discretionary income. And when I'm talking about income, we're talking about 3 things. We're talking about, when you get a job, they tell you what your salary is. Then you get your paycheck, and it doesn't quite equal the salary because they take taxes out. What you get in your paycheck is your disposable income. And then once you pay for things that you must pay for, like housing, food, healthcare, clothing, those kinds of things, what you have left is your discretionary income. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing that's important about wealth is banks are critical. You cannot build wealth in America if you don't have access to banking. And according to the Federal Reserve, 55 million people, 22% of the American households, are unbanked or underbanked. And many of those people are considered what is unbankable, which means banks will not, either because they've had they've defaulted or whatever, or their credit score is too low, they can't get a bank account. So let me just first talk about income and how that works. What this chart shows us in this first column here, that's the area median income for San Diego County. That means half the people in San Diego County, half the families in San Diego County are making $92,000 a year or less, and half are making $92,000 a year or more. The AMI for San Diego, the city, is a little bit lower at 71,000. And then I also show here City Heights and Southeast, and you can see that their incomes are significantly lower. What this red column tells us is the federal poverty level. And in case you're not aware of this, if you're a family of 4 and you make $26,201 a year, you're not poor. You might be surprised if you're one of those folks, but that's the federal poverty level. Now, on the other side here, I want to talk about living wage versus minimum wage, right? A living wage is considered a wage that is large enough to pay for all of the things you need to pay for, with no discretionary income, but you don't need to draw on anybody else to pay your bills. So for a family of four, in this first column, this is a family of four, 2 adults, two school-age children with 1 parent working. You need in San Diego to earn $71,000 a year to be able to clear. If you have 2 adults working and 2 children, then it jumps up to $88,000 a year because you have to add things like childcare costs. And again, you can see how that relates to the federal poverty level. And these 3 columns over here show us what the minimum wage does. $15,080 a year. If you make the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, work 40 hours a week, you will still remain in poverty. What's wrong with that picture? San Diego County and San Diego City and California are a little bit better. You actually get a little bit above the poverty line. But the key here is that wealth is built from discretionary income. If you do not make discretionary income, if you do not have discretionary income, it is impossible to build wealth. That's where it comes from. So I want to take a look at that for a minute, looking at City Heights and then the city of San Diego. So we see the annual income, right, is $39,000 and $71,000. But and then you see the taxes. So if you are the average family in San Diego or City Heights, and you can see that the City Heights family has $2,200 a month for disposable income, and compared to $44,000. Now, if you take out things people have to pay for, and you will notice this doesn't include, it includes rent, food, and transportation, but doesn't include healthcare, it doesn't include school supplies, it doesn't include a lot of things. But what you will see is that the discretionary income is pretty low. If you live in City Heights and you're the average family, you actually have a negative $1,300. But if you are in the median family in the city of San Diego, you have $617 discretionary income a month. If you think about that, all it would take is a flat tire, engine trouble, somebody getting sick, an unexpected expense, and you can see that a family, the median family, so half the families in the city of San Diego, one could easily say, do not have enough discretionary income to begin to build wealth. Now, how is this wealth distributed? This diagram, this chart right here shows us, you can see the percentage of the population along the bottom and then the amount of wealth that they have. If you look at the economy of the United States as a dollar bill, what this chart tells us is that 80% of us share 7 cents, while the 20% have 83% to share. And so you can see the massive inequality, and it's fascinating to see how this is built over the years from Michael's presentation. I'm going to just flip through these really quickly because it's really just meant to show, and again, Michael showed this well, but this just reinforces that. You can see the red line shows us the degree of inequality in wealth. Starting from here, we're talking about 1963 up to 2016. It's just increased significantly. And if we look at issues of race and ethnicity, we can see that between 1963 and 2016, whites have been able to increase their wealth 10 times more than Blacks or African-American families, and 8 times more than Latinx families. One of the reasons, I think, for this disparity has got to do with home ownership, because as I think we all probably know, most middle-class people's wealth is in their homes. That's why the housing crash in 2008, 2009 was so devastating, because it wiped out enormous amount of wealth among the middle class. But you can also see there's a great disparity between Black and Latinx people, home ownership rate and white ownership rate. And so where does this come from? First thing we need to recognize, it's not a mistake, it's not an error, it's built into the system, that advantage begets advantage and disadvantage begets disadvantage. And that it's, and from my study of history, it is clearly rooted in the legacy of slavery. Our major financial institutions, the processes from insurances to mortgage, et cetera, were created in response to the enormous wealth being created by the sale of human beings. And my life has taught me any system built on oppression cannot lead to equity or equality. So we have to deal with this horrific legacy. And so the way this gets translated is the media has played a huge role in racializing poverty. The persistent and reinforced idea that African Americans don't like to work comes from, guess where? Slave owner descriptions of people of African descent. For some reason, being a slave did not make you a very excited worker. And so as opposed to defining those acts as resistance, they were defined as laziness. And in fact, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, just maybe 3 weeks ago, made the statement that African Americans are behind whites economically because they just don't want it as much. So we're not talking about a stereotype that's disappearing. But so where does this come from? In 1959, less than 20% of the newspaper stories about poverty referenced African Americans. First, there were very little stories. Prior to the war on poverty, media didn't report very much on poverty. And when they did, they didn't really talk about African Americans. But with the war on poverty in 1972, by 1972, 75% of the stories about poverty referenced African Americans. And in 1992, 80% of the newspaper stories about urban problems referenced African Americans, even though less than 6% of African Americans living in poverty lived in urban areas. And so we have been for years being shown poverty, African American, poverty, African American, urban problems, African American. This creates this image for us. So where did this come from? For people who don't like government action, they should know that the government action is what created the middle class. And we can speak to a small handful of legislation. There was the Federal Housing Act of 1934 that made long-term mortgages access to people. You can now, more people could buy a home. Prior to this act, most cases, if you were buying a home, you had to pay 50% down and pay the other 50% off in 5 years. This created the 30-year mortgage, which clearly made it possible. And then there's the Social Security Act of 1935 that, as we know, lifted most or many elderly out of poverty and created some security for them in their old age when they could no longer work or earn a living. Then we had the Wagner Act of 35 that gave unions the right to organize and protected unions. And whether you like unions or not, they have been an enormous boon to the working class. We know that union workers do much better economically than non-union workers. They're also more productive than non-union workers. There was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill, funded college, subsidized homes. If it wasn't for the GI Bill, I wouldn't have a PhD, and nor would I have bought my first home. And then the Federal Highway Acts of 1938 and 1956 that built the highway system and allowed the suburbs to develop. Also, importantly, we had about 11 million GIs coming when the war ended, and building the highway system was a way of giving them employment. And lastly is public education. And while it's not a single piece of legislation to refer to, but in America, we believe strongly that the American dream is that anybody born in any station can achieve anything they want if they have the talent and they put in the work. And if they're not born into privilege, then education is how they do it. And that is about as strong a myth in America as any. But as we look at, yes, they created the middle class, but as they did so, they also institutionalized the great racial divide. Because those access to housing, African Americans in their language were deemed to not be creditworthy. When you're giving someone a 20, 30-year mortgage, you want to know if they're creditworthy. Well, the color of your skin was criteria. And if it wasn't white, that meant you were not credit eligible, creditworthy. The Social Security Act excluded agricultural and domestic workers. At this time, about 85% of whom were people of color, many women. And so they did not get access to Social Security. The Wagner Act also excluded agricultural and domestic workers. They did not get benefit. I think probably the first agricultural union was the United Farm Workers that came along in the 60s. Unions were extraordinarily racist, and back in those days, it was often the unions that did the hiring, not the employer. So if you weren't in a union, you couldn't get the job. And if you were black or brown, you probably couldn't get into the union. The benefits, again, American unions, I think is one of their critical flaws. They got benefits for their workers and no one else. So you couldn't get in a union, and if you couldn't get in a union, then you weren't getting any of the benefits that other workers got. And for the service bill, racist admissions and housing policies blocked African Americans. There were actually a drop in African Americans in post-secondary education after World War II, when they had greater resources for it. Housing policy, as the suburbs were built, many of those suburbs had covenants that people would agree not to sell their houses to people of color or to Jews. In fact, La Jolla once had a covenant that no one would sell their house to someone of the Jewish faith. And so while you had technically access, it didn't work on the ground. And the highway system is what facilitated white flight and also led to a lot of the decay in our cities, because as white people exited the cities into the suburbs, and I know that my family was one of them. I'm a Levittowner, for anybody, the first suburb in the world. Moved there when I was an infant. But with the suburbs came work, came shopping, and again, covenants that kept people of color out of those areas. And as those white people moved out, the tax base in cities collapsed. And cities began to deteriorate. At the same time, we begin to see African Americans becoming mayors. The first mayor, I think, was in Cleveland. And here they are given a city with almost no tax base to work from. And then lastly, race and economic segregation. I mean, if you look at our schools, while everybody has access to education, everybody does not have access to a quality education. So those are the laws, but here's some of the things that happened on the ground, because banks and the public sector, private sector played a large role. Redlining, for example, where as a practice where community banks would decide we're not lending any money in this community and let them collapse, and then we'll be able to turn it over. And if you think this is an old thing, I did a quick web search and quickly found within 5 minutes 61 cases of redlining. And here was 3 of them that I picked out. And if you look at the size of the settlements, you can see these were not small. And also then for the agriculture, the delayed crop loans, small farmers depend on crop loans to cover setup costs. Banks would often delay or deny these to African Americans. And if they got them, it was too late to compete with their white farmers. So how has the government responded? Okay, because we live in what's called a welfare state, which where the government recognizes it has some responsibility for the quality of our life. And we do it in 2 ways. Through direct expenditures, which are money that we see. That's where education, healthcare, cash benefits, if you're on CalWorks or SNAP or CalFresh, you would see that. The tax expenditures are more hidden because they're not actually giving people money, but it's not collecting money that the government could be collecting. So things like the most popular one is that if you own a home and have a mortgage, then you know you're deducting in your tax every year the income on your mortgage, and that's a tax expenditure. And if we look at who these benefit, in total, 57% of the public spending goes pretty much to public direct. So most of it goes to direct, but a significant portion, 43%, go to tax expenditures. And if we begin to look at who benefits from those, we look at who benefits from public expenditures. Again, we tend to think, oh, poor people do. Well, that's not really true, because 66% of that money goes for universal services that we all have access to, like police, like school. Our kids go to public schools, no stigma in going to public school. Libraries, all of that is part of that universal spending. This 34%, there's only this third of it is what goes to other folks. Mostly the biggest part of this for low-income folks is the earned income tax credit. But these are also very stigmatized if you have to apply for benefit. And when we look at who benefits from the tax expenditures, we see again, a third goes to people who make less than $50,000 a year, and 2/3 go to people above that. Again, you can see things like your write-off of your mortgage on your, the tax on your, the interest on your mortgage. And again, earned income tax credit is the large piece of this. So even as we go ahead, we see that again, privilege begets privilege and advantage begets disadvantage. And upwards of 80% of people's wealth is passed down from the previous generation. So affluent children get to build on the foundation of their parents, and unaffluent children must start from scratch. And you really see these in neighborhoods of color where those families don't have access to the wealth building paths that white families have. And so in communities of color, generally each generation starts at zero and has to build. And then by the time they have little. So, and again, education has been designed as that which lifts everybody, but the quality of education is best based on where you live, and where you live depends on your social class and your ethnicity. In fact, today, your zip code is a better predictor of your longevity than your DNA. And so let's look at education. I'm going to go through this quickly because I know my time is up, but most states' funding is based on property tax. So wealthy towns are highly resourced, poor towns are poorly resourced. Nationally, 50% of African-American and 40% of Latinx graduate from high schools where graduation is not the norm. That means less than 50% of the children who started that high school actually graduate. And so this is a significance. And American schools are more segregated today than any time since 1969. And in San Diego Unified, there are no poor performing schools north of 8. All poor performing schools in the district are south of 8. And so just real quickly to give you an example, this is looking at from 2015 to 2019, how students at Hoover and Crawford High School are doing in relationship to the rest of high school students in San Diego. And what you can see is the gap in English language arts and mathematics is significant and persistent. And so you can see how I heard Shirley Weber speak about 2 or 3 months ago, talking about the Green New Deal and saying that's really great, but these kids are not going to be able to get those jobs because they're not qualified. They won't be qualified for them. And so we can see where, again, we're passing on disadvantage. And so to close up, this is what is called structural vulnerability, right? And that means not everybody in society is equally vulnerable. It impacts large folks, and it's mostly based on ethnicity, gender, and social class. In all areas, women fare worse than men, people of color worse than European Americans, and poor fare worse than middle class folks. So now I wish I had specific solutions, but I think some ideas we need to think about is, one, we need to recognize the fact that poverty is caused by decisions made by very powerful people, not by poor people. Right? Because the image, and Joni referred to this, is poor people create their own hell. Well, no, they don't. They deal with the hell somebody else has created for them. That we need to provide living wages that allow families to have discretionary income, because without it, they cannot build wealth. And I identify the Red Roses strike of 1912 here because this was an amazing strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where the women who were striking were saying, we need bread, but we want roses too. We work, 60, 80 hours a week. We deserve the right to go out to dinner and buy a pretty dress or something. And so as we begin to think about this, we have to think about wages as more than just helping somebody stay out of the poorhouse. We need to close the educational gap so all children have equal access. And that's it.
Thank you all so much for having me today, and thanks for those great presentations. By way of just a reminder, PPIC, or the Public Policy Institute of California, is a nonpartisan nonprofit research institute that's focused on state policy. We don't take positions on legislation or on ballot measures. And my plan today is to explain the latest data on income inequality in California from this nonpartisan perspective, to put this in context of the research literature and unpack some of the policy tools that the state can use to address income inequality. As Bill and Michael have mentioned, this is a complex issue. And so part of the goal of this presentation is to help us get a handle on what we mean when we talk about income inequality. And I'm honing in specifically on income instead of wealth, for example, in part because there's just much more data available on income than on wealth at the state level. And so we can get a better understanding of the details on income. We at PPIC have written a number of reports on income inequality over the years, and this event is actually perfectly timed to preview some findings from our latest report, which will be out in early December. As you can see on this slide, the report is supported with funding from the James Irvine Foundation. So I know that we're already mid-event, but I want to take a moment to just talk about why we should pay attention to income inequality. It's clear why poverty is important to consider, especially for children, and especially when people are experiencing it persistently. But income inequality isn't just about poverty. You could eliminate poverty without eliminating inequality. And in theory, that could be okay as long as low incomes were high enough that people could meet some standard of living. But Californians clearly care about income inequality. PPIC's September statewide survey found that 60% of Californians say that government should do more to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. And researchers and others suggest that there are potential negative social, cultural, and political consequences of inequality. So from a purely economic perspective, high levels of income inequality may inhibit both overall economic growth and economic mobility, so making it harder for both low and middle income people to climb the economic ladder. High levels of inequality can also contribute to lower political engagement. And inequality not only reflects racial income gaps, but some of the factors that are driving growth in inequality, in income inequality, can effectively maintain or exacerbate racial income gaps. So for example, outsized gains for the highest income families widen not just gaps between top and bottom earners overall, but racial and ethnic income gaps, since the highest income families in California are disproportionately white. Now, you're going to recognize in this chart some of the trends that Michael was showing. Here we're looking at how pre-tax incomes for a family of 4 across the distribution in California have changed over the last 40 years. And so when I'm talking about top and bottom incomes, I'm referring to the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile here. Families that have incomes higher than 90% of all families, and those with incomes higher than just 10% of all families. And what this chart shows is that top incomes have grown by 50% since 1980, compared with 30% and 19% for middle and low incomes. Now, we regularly measure income inequality just by looking at the ratio between the top and bottom incomes, or the 90-10 ratio, which you're seeing here in this dotted line. We find that top incomes were about 7.4 times higher than bottom incomes in 1980, compared to 9.8 times higher in 2019. And you see here that during the last recession, at the high point, the 90-10 ratio had nearly doubled. You may note kind of on the right side here that we were seeing reductions in inequality by this ratio in the last few years, as low incomes were improving faster than high incomes. But we can caveat this by also noting that low incomes were starting growth from below where they were in 1980. And overall, what we can see is that the increase in inequality over this period of time has been characterized by growth in top incomes that's just not matched by growth for middle and low incomes. Another key feature of income inequality in California is that the income distribution is very skewed by race and ethnicity, and it's not really improving. So this chart shows how a median income family in each race ethnic group sat relative to the white family income distribution in 2005 and 2019. And that far left-hand column shows that the middle income Latino family is still doing only as well as about the bottom 5th white family. We do see that there are some improvements here for Asian American families, but I kind of hesitate to say how much that reflects economic mobility for the group, since we're not accounting for the effects of immigration over this time period. And I don't have a slide for this, but I do just want to note that there is some variation in income inequality geographically. There are, of course, large differences in median incomes across the state, which partly reflect differences in cost of living. We don't always find that higher income areas have higher levels of inequality, and LA County is a good example of this, which it has the second highest gap between high and low incomes, but a median income that's kind of in the middle of the pack statewide. And in case you're curious, for San Diego is right in the middle in terms of inequality by region, with top incomes about 9.7 times higher than bottom incomes. Now, there is a vast research literature on what has shaped the income distribution in the US, and obviously in California as well. And in particular, I want to point out that some macro level trends have been playing a significant role in driving the increase in inequality, in income inequality. So California, for example, lost middle income manufacturing line jobs in recent decades, in part because increased global trade and advances in technology led to constrictions in some industries and others being automated. As the returns to higher education have grown dramatically since 1980, high incomes have been driven up. And the job market in California continues to favor people who have advanced degrees. At the same time, in the last 40 years, on one hand, women's labor force participation has increased, And without that, middle incomes would have stagnated or declined. On the other hand, an increasing share of marriages are between people who have similar income levels, and the growth in couples having too high incomes has contributed to inequality. And then on top of these factors, tax and transfer policies haven't done much to mitigate the rise in inequality since 1980, and decline of unionization has reduced collective bargaining power. We also find in our research that income inequality has increased during almost every recession in the last 40 years. And this is driven by deep declines in income for the lowest income families and only modest declines for the highest earners. This is clearly playing out in our current economic crisis as well. And of course, it's only part of the story. Since low income families also have less in savings, we can see recessions as periods where they're not only taking a bigger hit on total family income, but potentially drawing down a bigger share of any savings than high income families are, and increasing inequality on that level. So how should voters and policymakers think about strategies to reduce inequality? First of all, we have to recognize that because income inequality has been growing for a variety of reasons, including those macro level global forces, there isn't a single policy that would reverse the trend. However, we do have examples of policies that are effective at reducing inequality. Second, there are ways to address income inequality in the short term and the long term. Some approaches work in both time horizons, others apply more to one or the other. And in the present situation, there's some balance between responding immediately to the recession and responding to long-term economic policy challenges. And then finally, state government in California has a role to play in addressing income inequality, but it's budget constrained. And so the federal government has to play an outsized role in this area. And so in the next few slides, I'm going to explore policy levers with most potential for reducing inequality in terms of safety net, tax policy, education, and support for caregivers. So when I talk about the safety net, I'm referring to things like food or cash assistance, like CalFresh and CalWorks in California, and tax credits for low-income families, like the earned income tax credits. And these are programs that work. They aren't necessarily operating at the scale of the problem of, say, poverty, and they're generally fragmented in terms of eligibility. But our research at PPIC finds that they do reduce both poverty and inequality. So this slide comes from some of PPIC's previous research and shows how individual programs reduced inequality based on after-tax incomes in 2016. So the measure's a little different from what we were looking at before, which looked at pre-tax income. But what we found is that the 90-10 ratio would have been about 40% higher absent safety net programs. Now, safety net programs work to reduce inequality in the short term by helping people meet their immediate needs. And because they're targeted to low-income families, they effectively raise the bottom end of the income distribution. There's also evidence that they can have long-term impacts on inequality and opportunity, particularly for food assistance and the earned income tax credits. The major constraint, of course, in turning to safety net programs to reduce inequality is that many of our programs are California's implementation of national programs, which means that the federal government plays a large role in funding and setting rules for eligibility. And so if California wants to provide aid beyond what's set out in the program or to groups that are ineligible under federal rules, like undocumented immigrants, the state has to cover those costs, and it's expensive. Another constraint is that not everybody who's eligible for each program will participate, of course. Turning to tax policy, we might think here about income tax increases or taxing wealth, property tax reform, payroll tax reform. On the one hand, tax increases mechanically reduce inequality just by reducing top incomes and wealth. And as Michael explained, federal top tax rates historically were much higher pre-1980. On the other hand, taxes can finance spending in programs that boost low incomes in the short term and or improve economic opportunity in the long term. Constraints here are that California's capacity to tax more is somewhat limited. High earners can always choose to move to other states in response to tax increases, and increasing taxes can potentially create some disincentives. Tax increases are also politically divisive, and they can be difficult to pass legislatively or through ballot initiatives. And it's also more difficult to tax wealth than it is income. Looking at employment training or education, we might think here about community colleges or four-year degrees or sector training programs. In the short term, education or job training programs can help people who are currently out of work or in low mobility jobs to upskill or to prepare for good jobs. This has long-term significance for workers, especially in sectors that are projected to experience structural changes in the coming years. Research also shows that higher education is a pathway to good jobs and upward economic mobility. So investments in expanding access to higher education and increasing affordability for low income and African American, Latino, and Native American students who are currently underrepresented in higher education could reduce income inequality in the medium term and increase intergenerational economic mobility. One constraint on building up any of these programs is that they can be expensive to run if funded fully by the state. And while public-private partnership job training programs can work, they can also be difficult to scale and to replicate. And there's also the uncertainty over the direction of future workforce needs, which makes it difficult to plan. So finally, turning to support for caregivers and dependents, here we might think about subsidized childcare, transitional kindergarten or pre-kindergarten or paid family leave. Access to high quality, affordable childcare allows mothers in particular to remain in the labor force, which has both short and long-term implications for family incomes and for gender gaps in the labor force. Adequate funding for childcare providers in particular could reduce both short-term financial hardship for the providers and increase long-term economic mobility for childcare workers who earn low wages and are disproportionately women of color. And research finds that early childhood education has very robust benefits for children that pay off over the long term. What constrains additional investments here is again that they pose significant costs to the state, and those really robust benefits for children aren't immediate. Of course, during the pandemic, it may also not be feasible to expand childcare while there are limits on in-person options. So I've given a very brief overview here to a very complicated issue, and there are many policy areas that can impact and be impacted by income inequality that I haven't talked about. But whether you're approaching this issue of income inequality as a reader or as a decision maker, some of the key ways to consider the policy responses are to think about desired outcomes. So policy tools can operate on different scales and with different levels of precision. To think about funding constraints and the relationship between the state and federal government. So a solution can be actionable at both levels, but you might also have leverage mostly at one level. And then finally, just the complexity of the issue. So in as much as income inequality has grown dramatically as the result of many factors, we can't expect a single policy to reverse the trend. Reducing income inequality will likely require policies across many areas aligning around a shared goal and making investments with an eye to the long-term benefits. With that, I'm going to turn it back to the others for our Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Tess and Bill and Michael and Joni for those that great information. It was very complicated and thorough, so I appreciate your kind of bringing us along with you on your research and the information that you've gathered on this topic. So we actually do have a couple of questions. I'll start with, I'm going to pose one to you all to just think about, and then we'll come back to it after you've had a chance to think about it. So I'm going to pose this one, and then I'm going to go to a second one. So the first question was, can you think of an example on the recent ballot of an initiative passed or maybe even not passed by voters that would have affected the topic today and perhaps working for or against the middle class interests and those of low-income persons. So I know this last ballot was very full, but we had a couple of bonds and we had some other initiatives that perhaps would have addressed the issues that we all are talking about here today. So just think about the last ballot and come up with any suggestions you would have had that for us as kind of like a practical matter to have helped us think about those propositions in a way that would have affected what we talked about here today. So we'll come back to that after you've had a chance to think about the November ballot. But instead, I'm going to go to the next question while you are thinking about that. And then whoever is interested in taking it can take it. or maybe two or three of you, maybe all of you want to have a say at this, but what do you think the proper narrative should be to encourage voters to look under the hood of proposed policies that can affect economic inequality? So that one's closely related to the one I just asked about a particular ballot initiative. So what do you think the proper narrative should be to encourage voters to look under the hood of proposed policies that can affect economic inequality?
Well, Lori, I think I can take on your first question.
Okay.
I think it's pretty obvious that the one that one of the initiatives that was most destructive to the interests of income inequality was Proposition 22. That was the Uber and Lyft proposition that basically condemned low-income drivers to being locked out of the middle class by requiring that they be designated as independent contractors, even though they are not in any way independent contractors. Basically, it deprived them of the ability to organize in unions. It deprived them of access to unemployment insurance, to workers' compensation. It condemned them to paying their own expenses. And as we know, for the vast majority of drivers who are driving really as part-timers, expenses will reduce their income to well below minimum wage and maybe put them in the red for all the hours that they're actually driving. This was a terrible initiative. I've been talking to experts about ways that we might be able to get around it. That will require federal action. But it basically is the worst attack on the path to middle class economic equality that we've seen in, I think, since 1935.
I'd like to add something to that from the ground floor, because many of my clients have been Uber or Lyft drivers because they had to amplify their cash flow in low-income families. And to the last person, I don't care how many people I talk to about this, they say the same thing. You get an immediate kind of boost in cash flow. It's not much, but it sort of like gets you by for something that's running short in the rest of your mosaic of family income. But you use your car, you wear it out, you pay for gas, you take the risk of accidents and fatigue and all the rest of that. You deprive your family of the use of the car for other reasons. It's a losing proposition. So the only thing that it does is it provides an immediate, short-term, very brief solution to a cash flow problem. In the long run, you always lose.
Yeah, I would just add one thing along those lines. Joni, you're right. I think your clients have come to this recognition probably after experiencing it. What Uber and Lyft didn't want you to know, or didn't want the public to know, when they talked about how the vast majority of drivers were in favor of Proposition 22, is that there were really two categories of drivers for Uber and Lyft, and also for workers to some of the other companies that spent millions of dollars of their investors' money to pass this egregious thing. The vast majority of drivers are very, very part-time. They might drive far fewer than 20 hours a week. And although there are a majority of drivers, generally the vast majority of them don't even last 6 months on this job, and that's because they enter it partially. They enter it as Joni, as you said, to get over a temporary hump, but also because after 6 months, they recognize how little they're earning and how deeply in the red they are. There's a minority of drivers who actually account for more than half of the trips and half of the hours driven for Uber and Lyft. They're working close to full time. They really resemble full-time employees. They were heavily in favor of defeating Proposition 22 because this is a group from which the agitation to organize the driving group comes from. They're important. They saw Uber and Lyft, and still do, I think, as a path to the middle class, or at least to hang on to their status as middle class workers. And they're now really going to be disadvantaged.
Lori, if it's okay, I'd like to respond to your second question about the proper narrative that we might promote in order to get people to look under the hood of these proposed policies that can affect economic inequality. I defer in this question to the experts who really have a lot of data, but from a ground floor perspective, it's my feeling after many years in this work with low-income families that we have promoted and adopted in the United States I guess you could say, a personal responsibility ethic it's never been true. It says you can stand on your own and every little boat sinks or swims on its own. And if your boat's sinking, it's not my fault and I don't have to take responsibility for it. And by the way, if I did, you'd be capsizing my boat along with you. And we've had that narrative in this country for probably, I would say, since about we had it for a long time before. Then we went through the Great Society and those kinds of programs, and then we picked it up again in about 1974 and 75. And we started to see the breakdown, the deliberate breakdown of the kinds of safety net programs that Tess was talking about that really elevate not just the bottom level of our society, but all of us in the middle class. Just for example, when welfare reform first started, okay, there were around 10 or 11,000 health and human services agency workers. These were government jobs with benefits and sick leave and vacations and some kind of retirement funding. And those during welfare reform went down to around 3,000 jobs. Those were middle class people in there, and we lost them. So we keep thinking that if we can just talk about the poor as a separate entity, that they don't really matter, but they matter in every single way. They matter in every single way. They are in our homes when they had no health care, when they had poor nutrition, when they were living in their cars and not. I know people renting front porches, so they're sick, they're caring for kids, they're caring for elderly, they're working in the back rooms of restaurants and warehouses. They are with us. And when they fall apart, we start to see in the middle class this failure affect us. So I don't know how to change people's minds that the narrative has to start thinking about how we all fit together. And then if we don't take care of each other, if we can't see the way that we're all connected, we will all fall. So I don't know how to change that narrative, but I think it has to change in that way.
I'd like to add that when I firmly believe in how you define the problem dictates the solution, right? And so as Joni and Michael and Tessa pointed out, forever, we have blamed poor people for poverty most of the time. When I look at recent history and see the only 2 times there was a significant drop in poverty rate was the New Deal and the war on poverty. The New Deal changed the definition of the cause of poverty from poor people to the economy is not producing enough jobs. And so the federal government stepped in and created jobs, which reduced the poverty rate. I mean, they don't have an official poverty rate. I don't believe, Michael, you may know this, but for much before the war on poverty. But the expectation was prior to the New Deal, about 3/4 of the population lived in poverty. Afterwards, it was about 25%, right? And then along comes the war on poverty, which defines the cause of poverty as a lack of poor people not having enough power to bring demands on the system. And so that whole approach was to empowering low-income communities with the community action plans and all of those things that gave people that. And there we saw poverty drop from 25% to around 15%. We have now gone back to blaming poor people. And as you can see, our poverty rate hasn't changed since then. So I think a lot about changing the narrative is really being clear about who is causing poverty and getting off this. It's the poor person creating this. I mean, I remember a meeting one time, Joni, with Spin, where I forget her name, but was talking about, she made a statement that if I make a mistake, they blame me, but I don't make any more or less mistakes than anybody else. And she told a story about her daughter breaking her second pair of glasses in 6 months, a second grader. Like, wow, like that doesn't happen. But because she had to, she couldn't get any more. And she had to spend hours trying to just get glasses for her second grade daughter. And that same week, I broke my glasses. I ran over them in a car like an idiot. It took me like 3 hours to replace my glasses. I had to go in. And so you really see the demands on low-income folks is far greater, but because we blame them for their poverty. We need to somehow switch that, reverse that, as we did with the war on poverty and the New Deal. And so maybe some of the things that are coming out of the sort of progressive side of the Democratic Party are beginning to look at that. And one of the questions in the Q&A is, what about universal income? Well, the data on universal income indicates if you give it to people, they do really weird things. They stabilize their lives, they stop moving around, the kids do better in school, and everybody's healthier. And they don't reduce the number of hours they work. And that what they found was people didn't reduce the hours they work, but they demanded more money per hour so they could live on it. So I just add my 2 cents, or maybe it's 10 cents.
Thank you. Yeah, good point. So yeah, you did allude to a question in the Q&A. And so since we're talking about that, let's go through some of those. I'll ask the first one that was submitted. So Governor Newsom signed a bill authored by Assemblywoman Weber to form a task force that will study and make recommendations on African-American reparations. Do the panelists believe reparations is necessary to narrow the wealth inequality? If yes, what form should it take?
Well, I guess I'll jump in here. That I think what we know is that African Americans basically suffer the most from economic inequality. They have the lowest relative income. They have the smallest level of savings. They're less able than any other segment of the population to leave resources to the next generation. They come up short in every way. We know they need help. Whatever you call it, whether you call it reparations or not, I think is basically irrelevant and maybe even, I'll go out on a limb, maybe even injurious because you're labeling it in a way that's going to create political pushback from people who really should be recognizing the need for this assistance, and we'll start to question it if it's labeled this way. So I don't think labeling it as reparations is helpful. I think what we need to do is keep our eyes on the goal, which is providing a segment of the population that consistently falls behind because of racism, and that's racism today, every bit as much as historical racism. They need help. They should be assisted, and that's really where our focus should be.
There's something I'd like to add to that. I used to think about affirmative action as a kind of a reparation, because it was taking people who were reaching up and grabbing their hand and saying, I understand that you've been disadvantaged in this mobility. Let me take your hand and join us. And there were a lot of African-American people who first entered the middle class because of affirmative action. But I think more than that, so reparations doesn't have to be like Michael says, it doesn't have to be called reparations. It can be called some other kind of help. But sometimes when I think as a lawyer about what African Americans have meant to this country, I can't believe what they've contributed in this way. If it hadn't been for their continued investment of their hopes and beliefs in this country and its promises, in this Constitution and its guarantees, our laws would be almost empty of meaning for individual rights. We would have almost nothing under equal protection. We would have very little under free speech. We would have, these are the people who have reminded us time and again of what we can be if we really try. So I feel like, damn, we owe them something. We owe them whatever we can do, because if we find ways to lift them up, then we will lift all of ourselves up, and we will invest this country once again with the true meaning of its dreams, instead of this superficial flag-raising baloney that doesn't do a thing to bring substance to the promises that are made in our Constitution.
I just want to touch on one of the points that we raised earlier, which is, I am really curious to see what the task force comes up with as far as research and recommendations on reparations. I also think that there are many systemic disparities that we see that are based on structural factors, and those need to be addressed across systems and in some of the areas that I talked about, in the safety net, in dependent care, in higher education, and those are all also important components of racial justice.
All right, our next question is from Jane Andrews. She asks, given the outcome of the 2020 election for representation in Washington, what do you think are the prospects for either a wealth tax or a guaranteed minimum annual income, such as Andrew Yang's plan?
Michael, you're smiling. I can see it. I know you want to answer this.
Well, I'm smiling to hide my tears, I think. I'm smiling wryly. I think any program like that is going to require a Democratic Congress, and we don't have that yet. We may have it after December 5. Cross your fingers, but it would require legislation. We're not going to get that from a Republican chamber. I've written about the wealth tax as it was proposed by Elizabeth Warren during the campaign. I think it's a good idea. I think it's needed. I think it's necessary. I think the accumulation of wealth at the high end, to the point that we have persistent family fortunes, is, first of all, not something that the founding fathers liked. Jefferson, among others, wrote harshly about it. So I think we need it. We need it both as a signal that we believe in economic equality, and also because it will raise revenue that needs to be redistributed to the rest of the economic spectrum. But in terms of guaranteed income, as I'm sure you all know, there have been pilot programs on that, and as I think Bill pointed out, they've worked quite well. They have helped families make very good decisions. We're also not going to get that until and unless we have Democrats running Congress. But both of these ideas are sound and necessary. We didn't quite get there, or at least as far as we know. I mean, we may learn to the contrary, in another few weeks, but let's assume for now that we didn't get there this time around. So we need to work to do it in the next cycle.
There is a hopeless note, hopeful, not hopeless note, a hopeful note in that some of the progressive side of the Democrats have put out a paper on what they can do what Biden can do without legislative consent. Things like developing a national community development corporation, things like that. So there is some hope that things could be done, but I agree with you. And I don't see us taking 2 seats in Georgia. So I think it's going to be one of those frustrating 4 years.
Tess, there was something you said in your talk about, you said it's harder to implement a wealth tax than it is an income tax. And I wondered if you could go into that a little bit because it kind of relates to this question.
That was on my list of things to ask Tess. Yeah, thanks, Joni.
I would love to elaborate more, but it's not totally my area of expertise, so I don't want to mischaracterize it. I will say, with regard to the basic income, though, I just feel compelled to point out while we're talking about inequality that much of the increase in inequality has been driven by gains for the top. So even if it's important to make sure that people at the low end of the income distribution can meet their basic needs and potentially more, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've reduced inequality.
Good point. So why did you say the wealth tax is harder to implement than the income tax?
Well, in part, we just have more information about income. It's easier to understand what income sources people have. Wealth is a little bit slipperier. I think that's one piece of it.
People with wealth have a lot more power than people with income. The more money you have, the less that source of money is income. And so
I was thinking that I apprehended this. I was thinking it had more to do with the let's say the convenience and ease with which the IRS, our tax collecting agency, can go after little earners as opposed to big earners. I used to have an IRS attorney on my nonprofit board, and she used to say when they sent down the directives, start collecting more money, the first thing all the agents would do is head for the low income and the middle income. They'd never head for the big guys.
Why is that? Because the big guys had more resources to defend
Because
against?
they could fight and fight and fight, and it would be ages before you got anything from them. Well, we have a person in the White House right now who's shown us how that goes.
Yeah. Okay, we only have time for maybe another couple of questions. I'll ask one here from attendee Bud Snyder. Regarding minimum wage not keeping up with productivity growth, wouldn't that be partly due to automation? Wouldn't companies argue that their investment in technology is a justifiable explanation of the reduced amount spent on payroll?
I'm not quite sure that tracks right. The impact of automation in many ways basically enhances the ability of human workers to do their work and enhances their productivity. So, so I think probably the effect may be just the opposite.
and the major shift in wealth happened in the early 70s and had nothing to do with technology.
Interesting. Okay, so
Michael.
our last question, sorry, did you have something more to say? Okay, regarding people that are unable to get a bank account, are they able to utilize online payment systems like Venmo, PayPal, and Apple Pay? And could that help in building wealth? For example, if they are, maybe they're a cleaning lady and they collect their payments now, somebody pays them through Venmo, so they've got money in that account, then they could use that to pay for something else.
I think most of those services actually interface with bank accounts. You know, I know with Venmo, you give them your bank account information and they put money in and take money out of your bank account. And I think PayPal does it either through a credit card that you've got or your bank account. So,
well, there's something more to a bank account. It's not just the ability to put money into it and take it out. It's that when you're denied access to mainstream banking, you end up paying more for check cashing services or other kinds of things, you don't have, for example, there are a lot of places where you can't take advantage of a good deal because you need a credit card or you need some sort of bank association. And that's where poor people lose out. That's why you see these check cashing places and payday lending places flourishing, because they're needed. They're sort of like the poor person's bank, and they pay through the nose. If we paid the same interest rates that they do, that low income people pay in these places, we would never get ahead. But if you have credit and you have a banking relationship, you have access to a better term on everything that you do. And that's where poor people are lacking.
And there are banks, like credit unions in particular, that will work with poor people around credit rehabilitation. There's one in City Heights where you can get, they loan you $500, which you don't have access to. And then they take $42 a month out of your account. And as you pay that $500 down, you get access to it. But what you also build up is a credit record, that you have this loan and that you're paying it off. And so it creates a credit. But yeah, I mean, if you don't have a credit card, it's almost impossible to rent a car, right? You got to give them cash. They won't take a debit. And so, yeah, when banking locks you out of a whole lot of things. You go to rent a house. First thing you want to know is your bank account. And banks are more expensive. I mean, a study looking at, Joni mentioned payday lenders, right? Most people pay about 450% on their payday lender loan. Folks, poor people in banks pay more, a higher percentage on if you count the insufficient fund fees as interest on a short-term loan. They're far higher than payday lenders. And so once you get, and that's how a lot of people get on banks. They they bounce a check for $4, and then there's a $35 fee, and then they get another $35 fee because they didn't pay that $35 fee, and it builds up, and now they walk away from their bank. Because what else can they do? They owe it $600 and they can't do anything. And then they go try to get another bank account and they're blocked.
So the league is looking into perhaps bringing a public bank to San Diego. We've had a couple of presentations about that, as you may know. And if that policy or that potential presents itself, we'll probably do like a brief study and see if we can bring it forward. So that might be an opportunity for activism here with our organization and other organizations that want to collaborate with us and our members and our panelists as well today. So I just want to throw that out there as a possibility of an opportunity going forward that might help everyone in our community with their finances and wealth inequality and holding on to what they actually earn. So with that, I would like to, we're a little bit over, but I want to thank everybody for sticking with us and attending this really important and meaningful program today. I want to thank Joni, our moderator, Michael, Bill, and Tess for your presentations and for the wealth of knowledge that you shared with us today. And I invite you all to continue to follow the League on Facebook, Twitter, social media, visit our website and keep up with us. And we'll be in touch. Thank you all for your attendance and for your participation.
Thank you. And thanks to Kim and you for arranging.
Of course, who runs the whole thing. She's our juggler. She keeps us all in the air.
Thanks, everyone.